I know. I just ate something. Chocolate covered almonds is what I ate. You think that's true about almonds taking up all that water? I don't know. Seems like it can't be. Oh, using all that water for almonds. We have a lot of almonds. We don't need that many almonds, right? The demand's not that high. You see them all over the place. We are here in the Bookless classroom. This is Dr. Annette, or you can call me Miss Annette if you are 12 or younger. Otherwise, if you're a prosecutor, you call me Dr. Annette, or whatever. We are reading Lewis and Clark Expedition. So, I don't even know. So, we got about halfway through this, and if you remember, we have been moving along to determine how the United States was settled, right? Talking about and we talked yesterday for a long time about the very big question that we got from that Edmund Morton, right? The Edmund Morton, here it is, Edmund Morgan book, right? That we got. So really the big large question is to what extent and we learn from history, right? We're not perfect. We learn from history. So to what extent do we impose our ideas and values on other cultures and other people? And this is always the question. It always has been the question since the beginning of time, right? The snake started imposing his will onto Eve. If you want to go back that far, right? And yeah, and if you like those stories, as I do. Okay. So, and the stories of our American history. I really like those stories as well. As I've said, we end up getting, some great details when we know that somebody is telling us the story and they have been there themselves, right? People can make up details and act like they're details, but what we find out is if it's not true, that the connections between the details don't make any sense, right? So somebody can give you a lot of details about something, and even then, if they weren't there to experience it, they have to give you those details from someplace else. Okay, I think we were on page 23 is what I think I said, if I remember correctly. Yes. So we were stopping and we were kind of interjecting. We were all stopping because if I stop, we all stop, right? And I was stopping sometimes, interjecting some of the really more interesting things that I found on this expedition. Like what they were trying to do is they were curious about matching cultures to. So we see stories here in a new land, right? And they're matching stories that they said came from the lost tribe from the Bible, right? If you remember that. And I said, I thought that was the tribe of Benjamin. And so that would be really interesting for somebody to find out. Is that the tribe of Benjamin? I would like to know. There we go. Here it is on page 6. So a popular belief was that those Indians were descendants of the biblical lost tribe of Israel. And Rush wanted to know whether their religion resembled that of the Jews, right? So we've got that interesting little tidbit over there. Then we also have the interesting tidbit. If you wanted to do a little bit more investigation on the Louisiana Purchase, I think that is really very interesting. They did not want Britain to take that land from them, so they sold it to the United States for pennies on the dollar, or basically $15 million or $8.50 an acre, something like that. Oh, my coffee. Hold on just a minute. I really was dying for a cup of coffee because I didn't get it this morning. And so we're going to do a little be right back. I'm going to be right back. All right, I can't do the be right back because that's the wrong date. I hate when I forget to change that date every time. You'd think that that would be the easiest thing to remember, and it's just simply not. Or to get it right every day. I do remember to do it, and somehow can't get it right every day. Okay, so yes, so the Lost Tribe of Benjamin, so that was interesting. What else I found interesting, I knew that there were a couple other things. So the Louisiana Purchase, if you wanted to do a little investigation on that, that is kind of interesting. But also I found interesting the story of the Indian girl. So again, they very often took Indian women and they enjoyed young girls, which is just really, not very good. And because it really does damage the spirit of young people when they are thrust into an adult world and forced to behave like an adult when they're still children. It's as a doctor in psychology, that really bothers me. And I shouldn't do this. I know I shouldn't do this. But there was another thing in there too that I said right after that Bible thing that was also very interesting. Was also interesting that Lewis was depressed. So that was also interesting. He was an introvert and he was depressed, and it seemed like Clark was exactly the opposite, but that they got along very well. So that was very nice. There were chiefs here that they mentioned. Black Buffalo Bull, not Black Buffalo Bill, Black Buffalo Bull. And then the partisan that they were worried about, if you remember. And they were with the Corps of Discovery. They were funded by the Corps of Discovery, right? And they had men from the Corps of Discovery. Remember, Toussaint Charbonneau was suddenly visited by his wife, and that wasn't very good because he had purchased the slave girl. Here's where it was. Sacagawea. Sacagawea. And she was a Shoshone Indian. And so here you're getting the different tribes. That was the other thing to maybe somebody wants to investigate the other tribes. So there was the Sioux Indians, but there was another tribe of Indians that appeared to be kinder because they were on the shores, right? Thinking that they were impressed with the fish that Lewis and Clark caught. Probably not both of them at the same time, but you get the idea. And then that story of Sacagawea, right? What is her story? Okay, I think that the village there too was called the Mandan Village there. So that's something interesting that you could look at as well. Very interesting, right? And Sacagawea had a baby that was named Baptiste. Very interesting, right? Because that reminds you of what? Like baptism, for example, right? Okay, so that wasn't a very good. It was only in my mind, and since you can't read the words, it was probably not a very good review of where we've been so far. Sorry. But we're going to continue. So page 23. Lewis hiked miles ahead of the party with a private named Hugh McNeil. The river became so narrow they could jump across it. Finally, they could straddle it. At that point, Hugh McNeil bowed his head and offered a prayer. He thanked God for letting him live to see the day when he could behold the broad Missouri with one foot on either side of it. Isn't that interesting? He would be so thankful for that. That's so interesting to me. Later that same day, the two discovered another stream. Lewis stopped to take a drink. He stared at the water with a puzzled expression on his face. West, he finally said. The stream is flowing west. It was true. Throughout their long journey, the explorers had been struggling against rivers that flowed east to enter the Mississippi. Without knowing it, the two men had crossed the Continental Divide. From now on, the waters they would encounter would flow west to empty into the destination of the core of discovery, the Pacific Ocean. Oh, look at that. Can you imagine being the first individuals to travel across the United States? So that's what they were going to encounter, their destination, the Pacific Ocean. But they crossed the Continental Divide. Now, honestly, I only have a real small understanding of what that means. I understand that Australian toilets swirl differently than ours do. But I didn't realize that here we had a Continental Divide. Which makes sense, right? Every continent should have a Continental Divide. I don't understand what that is. I mean, I do. I kind of get it. I get the concept. What is going on there, right? What's going on there for a continental divide so that the rivers begin flowing from east to west, right? Instead of from west to east. I just find that so interesting. Wow. Not quite the mind-blowing stuff we've had before, but still, wow. It gets a wow. At this point, however, they were out of river country. Facing them, I'll put the picture up now because we have a picture now. Facing them were the towering Rocky Mountains. They would need horses to cross the mountains. Sacagawea, Sacagawea had assured Lewis and Clark that her people would sell horses to the expedition. But where were the Shoshone? The expedition had seen traces of Indians, a lost moccasin, and an old campsite. Sacagawea's people, however, were keeping to themselves. In 5 months of travel from Mandan Village in the North Dakota to the foothills of the Rockies, the explorers had not seen a single human being. How interesting. The Shoshone were a small tribe who lived in constant fear of their powerful neighbors, the Blackfeet. They hid themselves in small villages in the mountains and were suspicious of all outsiders. One morning, an expedition hunting party discovered a lone Shoshone on horseback. They made friendly gestures to him, but the Indian galloped away. Okay, so there that we had the Sioux Indians that were acted horribly, like they said. And now we've got the Blackfeet, which they are also afraid of as well. Finally, Finally, they met 3 Shoshone women who led them to their village. There, Lewis met with the Shoshone chief, a tall, lean man named Kamiawait. That's what it looks like. Using sign language, Lewis explained that he needed horses and was willing to trade for them. Kamiawait debated the request with his fellow braves. An argument started. One brave insisted that Lewis was part of a plot and was working for their enemies, the Blackfeet. Lewis did manage to convince the chief to allow one of his men to find Captain Clark and the others and lead them to the Shoshone village. But it looked as if he would never be able to persuade the Indians to give up some of their horses. Lewis had the sick feeling that without horses, the journey of the Corps of Discovery would end right here at the foothills of the Rocky Mountains. Chief Kamiawait and the others were still arguing as Captain Clark and the rest of the expedition trudged uphill. Then a miracle happened. Sacagawea suddenly dashed towards the chief, wildly calling his name. The two were soon locked in a tearful embrace. Later, Sacagawea told the astonished captains that Kamiawait was her brother, whom she had not seen in 6 years. Who doesn't believe in miracles? I think dingbats. That's what I think. With Sacagawea to do the bargaining, the expedition was soon off again. This time they traveled on foot with 11 Shoshone horses and a mule as pack animals. So they put their packs on top of them. They put their stuff on top of them. So they were packing animals. It was late September and snow was beginning to fly as the explorers entered the Rocky Mountains. They followed the Lolo Trail, an ancient Indian path that wove in between and over mountain peaks. Almost every morning they woke up to freezing rain or pelting snow. Footing was treacherous, and even the sure-footed Shoshone horses tumbled on the winding trail. As soon as the expedition struggled up one mountain peak, they discovered an even higher one directly in front of them. A scarcity of game in the Rockies made their struggle even more desperate. Time after time, parties of their best hunters came back empty-handed. Sacagawea was an expert at digging edible roots from the soil, but roots could not sustain the men for long. They were soon eating candles. Finally, I can't imagine that is good for your stomach. Finally, they were forced to eat several of their precious pack animals. Oh, too bad. Too bad. Where are the rivers? Like, where's the fish? I don't know. William Clark, leading a band of hunters, forged ahead on the trail. The men had traveled for days without seeing anything to shoot. Suddenly, Clark found himself on a mountaintop looking down at an immense valley. He held his breath, hoping this valley was no illusion. Because sometimes we see mirages, they call them, right? Finally, he laughed out loud, knowing he had at last made it through the Rocky Mountains. Wow, that must have been really hard, right? Below him was the lush green forest of the Clearwater Valley in what is now Idaho. Do you know what Idaho is known for? Potatoes, Idaho potatoes. They don't just get a name like that. It actually does connect to something that's very real. After having struggled over one mountain ridge after another, this flat valley suddenly stretching to the horizon looked to him like the Garden of Eden. In the Clearwater Valley, the explorers built dugout canoes and started downstream. They were now in the wildly beautiful Snake River country with green timberland on both sides of the river. Game increased and red salmon could be caught with nets. The expedition had crossed the boundary of the United States. The men had traveled even beyond the newly purchased Louisiana Territory. They were now in the Oregon country, a land claimed by several European powers. There we go. Now we know who owns it. I didn't know. There we go. Europe. The exploration of Lewis and Clark gave great weight to the United States claim on Oregon. As the Snake River flowed into the Columbia River, the group passed many Indian villages. These tribes had traded with sailors from ships in the Pacific. Lewis saw one of them wearing a black navy pea coat. It was pouring rain in the morning of November 7th, 1805, as the party neared present-day Astoria, Oregon. After the rain, a blanket of thick fog covered the explorers in their canoes. When the fog finally cleared, they saw a sight many of them never really believed they would see. Lewis wrote, "We enjoyed the delightful prospect of the ocean. That ocean, the objects of all our labors, the object of all our labors, the reward of all our anxieties." Can you imagine that? Can you imagine that in your life, what you felt like your job was to explore all of the west of America to get to the Pacific Ocean? I can't even imagine. I can't even imagine, because it's hard for me to think about what they even knew at that time, right? Because they were trying to find a passage, an easy, short passage to the east. This obviously is not an easy passage. And so they knew the Pacific Ocean from the east, from coming from the east and trading from the east. Now they are getting the Pacific Ocean from the west, right? But they had to go through the land of America to get there. And that was, I mean, think about how large we are. So that was really, and they're discovering this land, not for the first time, not the first discoverers, right? But they are discovering it for the first time for the settlers of the United States of America, right? Okay. The gleaming Pacific spread before them, and they heard the roar of waves breaking on the beach. Their incredible goal had been realized. And also, the thing about the Pacific Ocean that they have is they also have a lot of cliffs. So could you imagine, I couldn't. Walking up there and seeing this, right? So there are no buildings, there's no nothing. You are discovering this from the west for the very first time. And like I said, on the Pacific Ocean, we know that there's lots of cliffs that when it smashes against, there's smashing against a lot of cliffs there. Could you imagine not just walking along beaches, but walking up to the Pacific Ocean as it smashed against a cliff that you were on? Could you imagine? Can you imagine? Arrival at the Pacific was not the end of the trail. The expedition still had to return home. Originally, the two captains had hoped to find a ship heading to the eastern half of the United States by way of Cape Horn. Lewis had a letter of credit written by President Jefferson himself, guaranteeing payment to any ship captain who would take the expedition back to civilization. Throughout the long winter, however, no ship passed the Oregon coast. Wow. So nobody is exploring that area. That's amazing. Lewis and Clark decided to return the same way they had come, by canoe, when possible on foot, when possible, on foot when not. The journey back to civilization was just as difficult, but not quite as spectacular as the trip to the Pacific had been. When they passed the Mandan village in North Dakota, Sacagawea and her husband decided to stay. All the men would miss the small Indian girl who had done so much to make the Lewis and Clark expedition a success. They would also miss her son, Baptiste, who was now more than a year old. 29 men and Lewis's dog, Scammon, sailed triumphantly into St. Louis on September 23rd, 1806, nearly 2.5 years later, after they had set sail from the same city. So 2.5 years, that's really not that bad, I don't think. Really, crossing America on foot. Who'd have thought? Throughout the hardships they had encountered and the thousands of miles they had traveled, only one man had been lost. Sergeant Charles Floyd had died of an illness only 3 months after the expedition began. That's amazing. All right, that's amazing. With they Roanoke, right? So the lost colony of Roanoke, Virginia, All of those people lost their lives. And Jamestown was down to what? So the first settlers, and what were they down to? Oh my gosh, were they down to 20 people almost? I'm not sure, but it does seem that way, doesn't it? Like 16, I don't even know how they, and then they brought more right on the ships, but dear goodness. They were the first people though who survived, right? They survived and then brought more settlers, and so were able to settle. How interesting. So only one person had been lost due to illness, and he was the first American soldier to be buried west of the Mississippi. The rest of the crew were the same men who had originally sailed with Lewis and Clark. What a successful expedition in such treacherous, I mean, it just seems to me like it was meant to be, right? In such treacherous, under such treacherous conditions, and then a very successful expedition. The Lewis and Clark expedition had traveled the length of the Missouri, crossed the Rocky Mountains, reached the Pacific Ocean, and come back again. Most of this incredible journey was over completely unknown land. It was an exploring achievement that will not be repeated unless one day man sets foot on some far off planet. That is the thing. This will never be repeated. Okay, folks. I understand that we are done a half an hour early, and we're done a half an hour early. I don't have anything else for you, and so I will be back here on Tuesday for our classroom. I figured I might get done early and I could, cram something in, but I don't feel like it. So this is our classroom. This is the teacher. I am Dr. Annette Feravich, and thanks for joining me in the classroom.